Recording started. Hello, and welcome to the Biophilic Cities webinar series. I'm Amanda Beck, a research associate with the Biophilic Cities project at the University of Virginia. Through this series, we will hear from practitioners and researchers who are creating positive environmental change, are balancing their city's ecological footprint, and are fostering increased connections with urban wildlife. The Biophilic Cities project started at UVA in 2011 to explore and advance nature in cities. In the fall of 2013, the Global Biophilic Cities Network was launched, with partner cities spanning the globe from Phoenix, Arizona, Singapore, and Wellington, New Zealand. The webinar series is one of the many ways in which the Global Biophilic Cities Network will help to disseminate knowledge about the innovative work of cities, organizations, and individuals around the world. And we would like to continue this new series to reach larger audiences who need to hear about the importance of biophilia. So check in with us after the new year to see what exciting topics we will have lined up. You can visit us at www.biophilic-cities.org/webinar-series. Today we'll be hearing from Bernard Unti, PhD, and John Hadidian. Mr. Hadidian is a senior scientist for the Humane Society of the United States, and he works on a wildlife protection program which advocates for wildlife and the protection of habitats that sustain wild animals. He has been active in the wildlife advocacy arena, and urban wildlife particularly, for over 30 years, serving on the USDA Wildlife Services National Advisory Committee as an associate editor of the Journal of Urban Ecosystems, and several consulting projects, just to name a few. Mr. Unti is the Senior Policy Advisor and Special Assistant to the President and CEO of the Humane Society of the United States, and works organization-wide on strategic planning, policy, advocacy, budget, fundraising, grant-making, charity compliance, corporate relations, and communication priorities. He's the author of Protecting All Animals, a 50-year history of the Humane Society of the United States, as well as several essays on animal protection and cruelty to animals as a historical and contemporary concern. His areas of academic expertise include the evolution of human attitudes towards animals, the history and sociology of the animal protection movement, the development of pet keeping, and the place of animal protection within American philanthropy. Hadidian and Unti will speak for 30 minutes to be followed by questions from the audience. So I will go ahead and turn it over to John and Bernie. Just go ahead and hit your talk button and it's all yours.
Thank you, Amanda, and hello everyone. Just doing a voice check. Can you hear us?
Yep, you sound great.
Wonderful. Amanda's done a wonderful introduction. I don't think we need to elaborate on that. I am the Senior Scientist for Wildlife. Bernie's the Senior Policy Advisor. So you're dealing with seniors. If we get grumpy, you'll know why. Now, I'm trying to start a slide here, Amanda, and it hasn't come up yet. So there we are. Okay, that's us. But who are we representing? So a little bit, just a very brief comment about the Humane Society of the United States. We're a nonprofit organization with about 600 employees. We were established in 1954, and we seek to create a humane and sustainable world for all animals, and to do so on a relatively large platform. In 2014, we really are two big organizations, HSUS, which is domestic, and Humane Society International, which are many far-flung endeavors in the rest of the planet. We have 17 departments, 7 affiliates. We directly run 5 animal care centers. We do not directly run animal shelters, but serve as a primary and principal advisor to many. And we have 44 state directors who cover 46 states now. So we try to establish a large presence across the landscape. particularly the political landscape. Now, we all know about cities because these wonderfully informative talks that have preceded us have talked a lot about them. Our only comment about that would be that cities are dominated by humans, obviously. They are the principal human habitat and the principal human future. In 2008, for the first time in our 200,000 years as a species, we crossed a boundary from where fewer than 50% of us lived in cities to more. So we are an urban populace now, globally, and that has huge implications for a great many things. Our particular task today is to talk about animals in cities. And the title that you saw on the bulletin board was Wildlife in Cities, but upon the slightest reflection, Bernie and I immediately understood that we needed to talk about a much broader set of issues than that. There are many classes of animals that are associated with cities, more historically and on their own trajectory. Many we don't raise animals for food in cities anymore very much. We have fewer working animals than we did at the turn of the century. So we're kind of currently, focusing more on pets and wildlife as the animal communities of principal concern and interest. But Bernie's going to take us through a little bit of that history and talk a little bit on the conceptual level before I come back to talk about wildlife later on in this presentation. So I give it to Bernie.
Thank you, John. As John said, the full range of animals and animal interactions represented on this short list in front of you. I want to bring in the overlay of animal protection as a social movement, which comes into being in 1866, just after the Civil War. We have a transition, there we go. And mention some of the moral and emotional drivers of that movement's emergence. There was the longer-term trajectory of reform from 1830 to 1860. There was the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, which played a significant role in kind of creating the space for animal protection to emerge and flourish. And there was the general dynamism of post-Civil War reform itself, including animal protection, which had strong ties to other movements, including temperance, child protection, most notably. But above all, there was a practical element, which was the incorporation, the swallowing up of animals, humans and animals together by the city, by the great urban metropolis, within a kind of utilitarian framework in animal presence where they were mostly still being used as working animals for food, etc., and a sense of crisis. If you can think of the early SPCAs not as simply moral reform agents, but also dealing in very practical ways with problems associated with animals being swallowed up in the urban industrial context. And we simply would note that this movement did not take much account of wildlife because of resources. Their focus was mainly on domestic animals that they saw all around them in the city. But I also wanted to share a nice example of biophilic and humane design from the 19th century, because both animal protection and the temperance movement sought to literally inscribe their values upon the landscape by placing these water fountains, which celebrated water as opposed to, say, alcohol consumption. Remember, they were competing with saloons that had troughs for horses outside. Your horse could have a drink while you went inside for a beer, and obviously provided the practical service of providing drinking water for animals and people, and of course the aesthetic uplift of the art itself, the art of the fountain. Coming to the modern era, I'll just let these 6 cases of some prominence be the signifier of the swelling concern for non-human life all around us in the 21st century. These are 6 cases, mostly well known. I'm not so sure if the pet food scandals are, but they really show, I think, the currency of animal protection and concern for animals in our national life. And coming more directly to biophilic design, which I love, John, Tim Beatley, and others have introduced me to this subject, which I like so much. And in following along with prior webinars, I think this is some of the things I'm about to say are well understood, and certainly better understood than I may be counted 2 or 3 years back. And I'll simply offer these points, which perhaps we can speak about later. The idea that biophilic design is not intrinsically humane. Animals may suffer or even die in systems of biophilic planning and design, notwithstanding. I think we ought to wonder whether, with respect to non-human life in animals, biophilic design could be instaurative and restorative, to use the language of the field, following on the principle that we do these things not just for our sake, but for the sake of all others around us. And now we turn to what we could call the current biopolitics. Some of you may come to this conversation through the use of the term zoopolis by Jennifer Wolch and others, but this adds a kind of political dimension to it. Biopolitics has a number of meanings. We take Foucault's reference to the exertion of power over life. It's the application of bioethics in a political context, or it's simply political advocacy concerned with the welfare of life, say environmentalism or animal protection itself. But we'll add for our discussion social, cultural, and design dimensions. And there's a practical agenda to biopolitics. It stems from political philosophers who point out that animal rights is very good about telling people not to do this, don't do that, but that we really need to shift to a more affirmative agenda for the animals and for non-human nature in our midst, and therefore need to shift from moral theory to the true relational obligations that involve humans and animals. And the broad thought being that animals may be the next diversity challenge in the liberal social contract. Some of these philosophers have divided the categories of animals we might consider in this arrangement. Domestic animals, talking about a kind of co-citizenship. We're not talking about rights in the strictest sense. For wild animals who live in still intact, preserved areas, we speak of a kind of sovereignty in the areas in which they live. And then in the case of liminal animals, which we'll talk about more squarely today, they are denizens of the very environments in which we live. They are our commensals and co-citizens, as it were. When it comes to an operational agenda of applying humaneness, from our perspective, there are measures of humaneness, there are measures of welfare, there are opportunities for improvement of planning and development practices. Certainly there's the prospect to eliminate inhumane practices and to prioritize animal-friendly technologies and methods wherever feasible. And for me, the premises of humanenesses or animal protection, concern for animals, engagement with biophilic principles is the idea that humane approaches reinforce biophilic principles. Humane approaches strengthen the integrity of biophilic approaches. And like biophilic design or thought, thinking humanely is itself a highly creative process, and one, I think, finally, that really enhances ecological literacy in a way that seriously advances the kind of long-term survival prospects for all of us. When we take a look at the city or any environment, we can even begin to talk about mapping that environment humanely. We have just provided a few examples where animals share space with us in most metropolises. There are some others that will occur to all of you, but we've thought it out just this far. And I want to turn towards John's end of the presentation by indicating that as biophilia is a reconnective paradigm, so is humaneness. And in the way we're talking about applying it in this presentation and elsewhere, it involves bringing humane convictions and meaningful knowledge to the resolution of the various challenges associated with animals' commensal status in the full array of built and planned environments that they share with us.
Okay, thank you, Bernie. And a lot to think about there. And I want to pivot now to wildlife, to wild animals, and to their relationship and interactions with us in urban environments. It's something I've been engaged in and thinking about for 30 years, not because I necessarily wanted to, but because I came to Washington, D.C. without a planned agenda and by default fell into a project to study raccoons that kind of opened my eyes, because prior to that time, urban wildlife was, to me, like to many, an oxymoron. I mean, who wants to talk about pigeons and rats and, God forbid, study them, even though they are eminently studyable. But I soon learned that our urban environments are rich in the sorts of wildlife communities that we see elsewhere as well. So I want to start with natural design. Here is a natural design. This is something that's been on the planet for a long, long time, and there are certain animals that have taken this kind of configuration, natural configuration, and made the most of it. So imagine the raccoon who dens in the trees that surround this little stream, hunts at night for the crayfish and the other aquatic invertebrates that can be found under rocks. Imagine that animal who suddenly is confronted with something like this. And immediately one can see, or I hope appreciate, the fact that there's almost an instantaneous adaptation. I know, and I'm speaking for the raccoon, I know this system. I'm comfortable here. I can cope with this. It's kind of funny that they bring these green things out to the curb and park them, and that's where I have to go often to get something to eat. I can den under these sheds. And oh, by the way, what I'm finding in these green things is pretty good. I'm not finding crayfish so much as lobster, and Haagen-Dazs to top that off perhaps, or maybe half of a Miller that I can enjoy as well. Hop in, hop out, and my night's complete. The urban environment, or the urban surround, or urban metropolitan complexes have an infinite variety of these sorts of things. This is a neighborhood in the heart of downtown Toronto, which is famous, of course, for its ravine system, which brings a lot of wildlife into the heart of the city, where their very well advanced urban forest often provides, perfect sheltering and food resource and denning opportunities. So both the raccoon and many species of birds and a lot of other small mammals know these systems, understand them, can cope with them. They may have to alter their behavior slightly, but this is something they can cope with. And then we have these systems, which to us look sterile, vacant, and unproductive, but which ecologically can be actually fairly important. So we have here a so-called vacant lot, which needs to be developed and paved and filled with cars. Of course, we understand that. But it's also, before we do that, engaged in a lot of primary, fundamental ecological services. So there's primary productivity going on here. There's a diverse community of plants. Maybe not plants that people appreciate that much, but plants which, are relative and important in an urban ecosystem. And most importantly, and I think here, what we have are, you can't see, it's underground. It's a whole community of organisms devoted to life in the soil, many of which have never been identified, many of which go extinct without ever being identified, but which serve an important, a very valuable purpose in driving the ecology of the urban ecosystem. So all of these things, the soil organisms, the soil itself, the plant communities, the water systems, as you've heard about already in this series, the air, all of those really overarching ecological processes are very, very important. Wildlife is not ecologically as important as many of these other things. So what is its value to us? Well, its value is that people identify with wild animals. They are tied to them, they feel empathy for them, certain species become iconic, and this is the social connection that is so critical if we're to preserve, save, and deal with the urban ecosystems that we need to emphasize the wild animals. Here, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does a biannual survey of Americans, how many people watch wildlife and spend money on wild animals. Well, it's almost 72 million in the last survey, of whom the vast majority do this in their own yards. Over 1 million jobs and a considerable amount of money, of financial resources are dedicated to buying things like bird food and bird houses and bird feeders and so on. And then we have all of these constructs that we've talked about in the context of biophilia. The well-being of people, providing people recreational opportunities, the restorative powers of green space, engaging communities in things that are positive and productive, and also embracing and encouraging a conservation ethic amongst people living in cities who might be losing that, that possibility or that opportunity. So the two, to me, really important concepts that biophilia kind of provides an umbrella for in the urban context regarding urban wildlife are biodiversity and humane conflict resolution. Biodiversity, we could take a long time to talk about, and it's something in urban systems that is just beginning to be studied, identified, and assessed. This graph to the right represents a very early attempt of almost 20 years ago to map the bird communities, the breeding bird communities in an urban area. This is Washington, D.C., for those of you who don't immediately recognize it. And it's a thermal map, which this is the very early days of thermal mapping in GIS. The red represents greater concentrations and diversity of species. And you can see there are places in this city that really are hotspots and that are good for birds. And this is but one group of animals, amphibians and reptiles and mammals and invertebrates, all need to be mapped and understood better if we're to create an overarching concept of biodiversity preservation as well as enhancement in urban areas. And I think most people agree this is one of the principal directions we want to move in. But largely, especially here at the HSUS, we dealt more with conflicts and attempting to humanely resolve conflicts between people and wild animals. This is an eastern gray squirrel, in case you don't recognize it. The title of this slide is Resting Between Depredations, because this is the #1 animal by any poll that's ever been taken associated with structural invasion and kind of getting in bird feeders and giving people, hard times. So we have at one level the conflict between the individual animal and the individual property or homeowner. We also have at another level conflicts that are community-wide. So the Canada geese nesting or loafing or feeding in the local park, the municipal park, or the deer that come in from the woodlots and attack people's azaleas and other edible plants in their yard. These are conflicts that occur on a community-wide level. They both need to be addressed. They both are being addressed in many, many communities throughout the country. But what is lacking, really, in two respects, is an ethic for how to address wildlife conflicts in cities, as well as a practical praxis for doing so. And I want to present you with just one example of the sorts of things we run into. I show this slide almost every talk I give on wildlife conflicts, and I say to people, well, what's going on here? And people say, well, these people have a raccoon problem. And they perceive that, that's understandable, but it's really not a raccoon problem, it's a trash problem. They have a problem securing their trash and keeping animals like raccoons who are going to be opportunists out of it. So rather than pay someone $300, which many, many people do, to come and set traps to remove these animals, take them away, to either relocate or euthanize them, the money should be spent on improving the security of the trash systems. So we talk a lot about terms like tolerance, understanding, prevention, education. These are swirling around the conversational environment right now for urban wildlife, and we haven't quite understood really what they mean and how to effectively apply them. But of all the things we know that we need to educate, and we know that one of the primary targets of any educational effort has to be children. And children, of course, learn by experience, so we need to provide them with these biophilic environments where they live to grow up in, to experience, and to learn from, and to create these broader concepts of how to live humanely with wildlife. We also need professional practice. We don't have, as do people who work in the field of environmental management, the regulations, the rules, and the restrictions that basically codify what you do as in the professional practice of environmental management. Look at the silt fences that go up around every development site now, but understand that those silt fences are not there because the developers are excited about spending the money on them. They're required to put them up. No such requirements apply to virtually any of the sorts of interactions we have with urban wildlife. So we've created here a concept we call Humane Wildlife Services that deals with the primary dimensions of response to people with problems, and even goes out into the field and provides direct services and as a kind of a business opportunity for people. So that's basically a quick introduction, I think, to the subject matter here. We're delighted and grateful to be able to present this to you. There's a lot more to be said of and about it, and we're hoping that this is just the beginning of a much broader dialogue that brings in folks from a whole variety of disciplines to inform and to educate us and to create these kinds of larger visions for the human-animal interaction, the human-animal relationship, or the human-animal nexus in urbanizing environments. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, John and Bernie. So a couple of questions, if you guys wouldn't mind. Could you explain a little bit more about what liminal animals are?
Right, liminal captures animals who are in our space, truly in our space. So the animals John's talking about, raccoons, they're wild animals, but effectively they're domestic in the sense of sharing our environment. But we know they're not domestic, so in a sense they're shifters. They're in a liminal space. They're in a kind of limbo, which is one of the reasons that their treatment, discussions of their treatment and their mistreatment are so ambiguous, and one of the reasons why they're subject to some cruelties that some of us don't know about. So they're kind of in an in-between space.
And that, I should mention, is a Bernie word. I like it. I'm warming to it. It's not something you find in the literature very often, if at all. But we also talk about synanthropes, commensals, anquilines, I think. There's a lot of terms, and this is indicative of the kind of like nascency, just the formative stages of urban wildlife, where we don't really have our lexicon down in the way you do in some other disciplines that look at urban ecosystems.
Great. Could you guys talk a little bit about if there are small-scale maybe even at the individual household level, changes that can be made to create more humanely biophilic cities?
Oh, absolutely. And you've seen a lot of advice already about how you design and employ native plantings and eliminate or minimize the excessive use of water and other resources, eliminate runoff of pesticides or try to minimize that, and as well as nutrients. And all those things are well talked about, well understood, and the individual contributions, of course, are beginning to be recognized as increasingly significant. With respect to wild animals, we actually do not think highly and often oppose feeding of wild animals, with the exception of birds. We've taken away so much habitat from them that the feeding activities that are directed at them are well placed. But people who feed raccoons, for example, just because they want to see raccoons, and people who feed coyotes, and they also do this, and people who feed bears because they want to see bears, those animals become habituated to human foods, and then they move down the street and they knock on someone else's door and say, "Can I have a handout?" And that person doesn't understand and kind of freaks out, and it usually ends up badly for the animal.
Kind of playing off of that, are there any laws or regulations that could improve this situation? And do you have any examples of existing code or proposed laws or regulations that you know of?
Yes. This is one of the things we work on here. We have a team that discusses these matters frequently, that kind of tracks what's going on out there in the larger environment. There is a whole private industry, the nuisance wildlife control industry, that started out very poorly regulated. State wildlife agencies typically should be the ones to regulate this industry. They often don't care or don't seem to pay attention to it until it becomes critical. And we can recommend, and I didn't mention, but our emails are there, and people can contact certainly either one of us. We had a model, we consider to be a model law, that was passed in 2010 in Washington, D.C., that kind of puts parameters around this business of capturing, evicting wildlife, doing it humanely. We have a whole paradigm or protocol for doing evictions even of mothers with litters in a way that allows for them to be reunited and for mom to move her litter to a new location. Right, these urban raccoons, urban squirrels, they always have alternate den sites. And it's just a matter of their long interaction with the world that they can pick up their babies and move them to another site, and that's just all in a day's work for them. So we encourage those kinds of approaches and strategies.
Wonderful. Do you have any ideas about planning or urban design scale shifts that can be made to create safer, humane biophilic cities for this urban wildlife?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it definitely deserves more thought. Right now, a lot of people are focused on connectivity because for some species, not so much for birds, but for reptiles and amphibians, having those ways of getting from one safe place to another safe place are really important. Not being isolated and at risk for stochastic processes that would lead to the elimination of populations, if not species. So we're thinking a lot about how to configure that environment with, juxtapose it with the access that people need and want to natural areas in ways that synergize both. So there are specific examples. I mean, we can go back to Ian McCard, for example, and talk about some of the design features that are appropriate. And the current biophilic movement, I think, talks to some extent about those sorts of things. A little bit more concentration and effort and research focus would be nice.
One thing I'm sort of curious about, maybe in between species and ethical concerns, do you think that humane biophilic design could be a way to alleviate issues of, I guess you could say, invasive species that are crowding out native animals? Or what ways can we start becoming more educated on issues like that so we can design more appropriately?
The invasive species issue is ethically, as you mentioned, kind of a complicated one. For one thing, we currently design environments that invite invasive species to be present and to outcompete natives. So the English sparrow and the pigeon and the starling that are in the downtown blighted, underdeveloped, disadvantaged, areas, they're there because other birds don't want to be there. Our native birds just don't like those environments. So until we change those environments, we're not going to see this kind of overturn of the faunal component. Once we do that, and I worked a lot in Rock Creek Park in almost downtown Washington, D.C., and just as an example, we trapped and trapped and trapped for all kinds of mammals there in part of our research. Very rarely in this forested area that's in the center of this major conservation did we ever catch Malay rats. But if we went downtown and set up shop outside a restaurant, that's all we'd catch. So we're kind of in a position where we have to change some fundamental things about cities and how they're designed and how they run before we can bring this disadvantage of numerous invasive species to a halt. And this goes for plants as well as for animals.
What are some of the most important education opportunities you see in a city like Washington, D.C. that should be taken advantage of for this building of a humane biophilic city?
Sure, that's very much on our mind. Humane education is one of the sort of primary planks of animal protection. Although it should be said that after a long time of sending people out to school to talk about the kindness ethic and so forth, we have limited evidence of its effect. Intuitively, we believe that teaching people about animals and being kind to animals will make them better toward animals and better human beings altogether. But the empirical evidence, the studies of that are not as developed as they are, for example, with environmental education, where, while not wishing to overstate it, I'd say the evidence does exist, and it's a little bit stronger. I think if we broaden our understanding of public education to include not just channels in the schools, but the full range of channels available to get people thinking about animals as co-residents of the city, denizens of the city with us, that can help. I'm within our own society always underscoring the point that getting laws, getting statutes passed, etc., aren't going to be meaningful environments where the advanced work of social marketing and education hasn't been done, and where those laws won't be taken seriously. So that's the kind of general answer I have to that question.
To which I might add, I'm a big fan of vacant lots, and knowing that kids, learn by direct experience, or learn perhaps best by direct experience, I would take kids out to a vacant lot and say, this looks like nothing. It's broken glass, and I don't know about the safety factors there, but it's not a biological desert. If you look and you start to identify different things in any vacant lot that I've ever been in, you find incredible diversity. You may not find mammals, but you'd find birds, you'd find arthropods, you'd find all kinds of different plants. And once you engage them in understanding the uniqueness and the differences there, and how all of those uniquenesses combine to make a biological community, then you've got them started on other things and trips to perhaps more, integral or holistic properties where there's a forest system intact, but you can bring the principles from they can watch for.
Well, thank you, John and Bernie, for providing more insight on what a humane and biophilic city can look like. Being able to connect with animals, whether domestic or not, is such an important piece of igniting interest and a sense of caring about nature in cities. So thank you for joining us today. And thank you to everyone who has attended the sessions this season. Stay tuned with the Biophilic Cities Project to see what topics we would like to offer after the new year. And you can check with us on the new lineup at www.biophiliccitiesorg-webinar/series.